She smiled at me across the table, calm, charming, and utterly unaware that I had already signed the first document that would dismantle everything she thought she owned. The air in the room was too quiet for comfort. Even the ticking wall clock sounded judgmental. I poured the tea slowly, pretending my hands were steady. Years of silence had trained me well. People think revenge begins with anger. They are wrong. It begins with observation. With the moment you realize that the person sitting across from you has mistaken your silence for surrender. She spoke about renovations, about turning the guest room into a study. Every sentence was polished, every smile rehearsed. I nodded at the right moments, but my mind was counting signatures. Hers, mine, the ones that would soon face a courtroom light. My child walked in, greeted both of us, and left without noticing the quiet war between us. That was fine. Some battles are meant to be invisible until the final strike. I remember when she first came into the family, polite, attentive, almost humble. Everyone said she was perfect. I had believed it too. But perfection is usually the first disguise evil wears. It hides its claws behind manners. It learns your weaknesses and waits. When she persuaded my child to transfer ownership of our property, she used love as her weapon. She said it was for convenience. That paperwork was a mere formality. Months later, the locks changed, my room was shifted, and I became a guest in the house I once built. I did not argue. I learned. That learning took years. I studied every clause of property law until the words felt like prayers. I spoke little, smiled often, and watched how arrogance blinds its host. She built her comfort on that blindness. As she kept talking about paint colors, I noticed her phone screen light up. A message appeared, her lawyer's name. She turned it face down quickly, pretending nothing happened. My heart beat once, steady and cold. So, she still trusted that lawyer. Perfect. The courier rang the bell. The sound sliced through the afternoon. She frowned, irritated by the interruption, and walked to the door. I sipped my tea. Moments later, she returned holding a brown envelope. Her face changed when she saw the legal seal. "It must be some mistake," she muttered. I said nothing. She tore it open, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes moved across the paper, and I watched the color drain from her face. She looked up, confusion flooding her features. "What is this?" I met her gaze, steady and calm. "It is the beginning," I said. She stared at me as if trying to read my thoughts, but she never could. She had always underestimated silence. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. I heard her make frantic phone calls behind closed doors. I let her panic bloom. Revenge does not need noise, it needs timing. That night, I sat alone in the small room she had assigned me years ago. On the table lay the same deed she had once forced me to sign. I traced the signature slowly, remembering how humiliation had tasted that day. Bitter, sharp, burning. Now, it tasted different. Predictable. I thought of my child, trapped between loyalty and truth. I had forgiven that weakness long ago. Sometimes, love needs to collapse before it can rebuild. When midnight arrived, I closed my notebook where I had written every date, every transfer, every lie. Pages of evidence. Years of patience. I heard her footsteps outside my door, pausing for a moment, then walking away. Fear has its own rhythm. I could hear it in her steps. For the first time in years, I slept without bitterness. The plan had left my mind and entered reality. There was no going back now. And in that quiet moment before sleep took me, I whispered to the darkness, "She will learn that silence remembers." I remember the first day clearly because of the small things that did not fit. The door chimes sounded too bright for evening. The perfume hung in the hall longer than a polite visit should, and the smile reached her lips faster than it reached her eyes. I had set out 2 cups of tea and a plate of sweet biscuits. She thanked me with careful warmth, hands folded, chin tilted in a way that said confidence without saying it. My child stood beside her, hopeful and soft, the way people look when they want peace more than they want truth. I welcomed her with open arms. I meant it, or I thought I did. I wanted a family, not a battlefield. On that first dinner, she told stories that placed her in the center without making it obvious. A scholarship here, a promotion there, a neighbor helped, a relative guided. Each detail shaped an image of competence. I admired it. Strength is useful in a household. Yet something about the timing of each praise from others felt rehearsed, like beads threaded on a line no one else could see. When she offered to help clear the table, I agreed. She moved through my kitchen as if she had practiced the floor plan, as if she had memorized the drawers. The months that followed were calm in a staged way. She never argued. She adjusted. She never demanded. She suggested. I saw how she would praise my child in public and correct in private. I saw how she would call at odd hours and hang up as soon as I answered, then call my child and speak for an hour. She praised my recipes and then labeled the jars herself, not in my handwriting, but in hers. It was not about tidiness. It was about territory. Money entered the conversation softly. At first, she talked about budgets, coupons, smarter shopping. I agreed and appreciated the effort. Then she suggested a joint account for daily expenses. It will keep things simple, she said. I nodded because simplicity keeps families kind. The card arrived in my child's name and hers. The statements arrived at her office, not the house. She said it was safer that way. I told myself not to be suspicious. Doubt is poison when planted too early. I fought my own mind and gave trust time to stand. Birthdays came, and with them new lines on paper. She gathered everyone for a toast and presented a small framed photo of our home, wrapped with a ribbon. She spoke about unity and shared futures, about security for the next generation. She looked at me with a smile that included me and set me aside at the same time. Then came the suggestion to consolidate utilities, then the car, then the property tax portal. Passwords moved from a notebook in the kitchen to a file on her laptop. She offered to handle these tasks since my schedule was heavy and my patience for online forms had limits. The change felt reasonable. Reason can hide traps when used in narrow slices. I began to notice how my child repeated her phrases. The tone grew measured, like hers. When I called to ask about an upcoming bill, my child said, "She is handling it." When I asked about a repair, the answer came, "She already arranged it." Solutions arrived before I finished my questions. Gratitude filled the room, but so did a subtle fog. People breathe poorly when someone else controls the windows. The first time I felt the floor give way was during a family gathering. A cousin made a joke about wills. Everyone laughed, and she laughed too, light and easy. She then touched my child's arm and said, "We have already drafted ours." I looked up. I had never heard about it. She noticed my surprise and turned the moment into care. "We thought it would ease your mind," she said. "Nothing has changed, only clarity." The words sounded kind. The look in her eyes told me to accept the gift and not ask what it cost. Little steps became longer strides. My child began to spend more evenings at her parents' place, and when I asked to join, she suggested that I rest instead, said I give too much and need to relax. When relatives visited me, she scheduled repair work on the same day, so the house would be noisy and inconvenient. When neighbors stopped by, she walked them to the gate before I could brew tea. She called it hospitality. I called it speed. A winter night fixed the pattern. My child and she returned home late. They looked tired, faces pale. From fluorescent office light. She placed a folder on the table and said there had been a mix-up at the land office. A form required my signature to update internal records. I read the page. The language seemed ordinary. A clerk had stamped it, and the stamp carried yesterday's date. She nudged the pen closer. I signed because I trusted my child and because I did not want to turn a long day into a longer argument. She took the paper back like a nurse taking a pulse. Calm, efficient, final. After that, calls to my child reached voicemail more often. When we did speak, the tone carried a new caution, as if I could trigger a trap without knowing it. She kept the rhythm of our home smooth, but she moved the beat. Deliveries arrived in her name. Bank envelopes went straight to her desk drawer. She introduced automatic payments and kept the verification phone on her side of the bed. These were not small adjustments. These were locks disguised as favors. I tried to bring warmth back with simple rituals. I cooked. I told old stories. I asked about work in plain language. She listened, smiled, and then shifted the conversation to tasks and totals, to compliance and deadlines. She made life feel like paperwork. She made my words feel like noise. That is how control grows. It does not roar. It hums. The first argument between us never raised a voice. I asked about a small transfer I did not recognize. She said it was a short-term adjustment that would return by the next cycle. I asked where it went. She answered with a receipt that showed a company I had never heard of. She said it was linked to my child's business unit and that I did not need to worry. That phrase sat on the table like a stone. I picked it up in my mind and weighed it. It did not feel like comfort. It felt like a lid. Days turned into quarters. I noticed my child withdrew from old friends, then colleagues, then cousins. She created a schedule that left no margins. She offered to handle calendars and then filtered the invitations. She would tell me about events after they happened. She called that less stress. What she reduced was not stress. It was connection. One afternoon, I found a letter from the registrar addressed to me, but delivered to the wrong mailbox in our street. The envelope had a tear near the seal, like someone had lifted and smoothed it. Inside lay a formal note confirming a change of correspondence address for property records. The new address was her office. I sat on the step with that letter in my hand and felt the simplest truth of a slow theft. It always looks tidy. That evening I waited for her in the kitchen. I asked direct questions. She answered with grace. Her words moved in circles that led me back to the same spot. She praised my care for the family. She thanked me for trusting the two of them. She said I deserved rest. She said systems would keep us safe. She smiled again and set a new file on the counter. It needed a quick initial to correct a clerical entry. I did not sign. For the first time, I took the page to my room and read it twice. The second reading showed me the trap the first reading missed. It was not an update. It was a release. I did not confront her that night. I folded the paper and placed it under the old photograph of my late spouse. I stared at the two of us in that frame and felt a kind of steady courage rise that does not come from rage. It came from duty. I knew that if I shouted, I would lose. She had built a plan that fed on noise. I would starve it with quiet. So I started to write. Dates, amounts, phrases she used, the timing of calls, the titles of documents, the way witnesses were arranged in simple family moments. I began to visit the land office on my own and asked for public copies. Clerks ignored me at first, then softened when I returned politely every week. I learned which door led to records and which desk kept stamps. I learned how signatures breathe when they are genuine and how they stiffen when someone forces a hand. One afternoon, the records clerk showed me a file that carried my name and a date I did not recognize. The transfer chain had a shadow where a witness should have been. The form referenced a meeting that never took place. The clerk shrugged and said errors happen. Errors do not change homes. Intent does. I walked back through the crowded street feeling lighter than I had in months, not because I had won anything, but because I had found the seam in the fabric. Once you find a seam, you do not tug in panic. You choose the right thread, you pull at the right angle, and the whole garment comes apart without tearing your hands. I returned home before sunset. My child greeted me at the door, tired and tender. I wanted to hold on, but I also wanted to protect. Love can do both when it is awake. She watched me from the end of the hall with that perfect softness that had fooled me at the start. I smiled back, gentle as rain, and set my bag down beside the chair. I had decided something simple and final. I would no longer ask for space at my own table. I would take back the table. That was the day I stopped being a parent and became a strategist. Silence became my shelter and my training ground. I learned how to move through days without giving away the work happening behind my eyes. I cooked. I answered polite questions. I attended gatherings with a measured smile. Inside, I built a different life made of quiet study and patient record-keeping. While others mistook my calm for defeat, I was learning the language that sits under every family dispute and every transfer of power. It is a language written in margins, stamps, and signatures. It is the language of paper. I started with the laws that govern inheritance. I read the basic acts first, then the amendments, then the cases that courts cite when. The text is not enough. I kept a notebook with 2 columns. In one, I wrote what the law says. In the other, I wrote how people twist it. The gap between those 2 lines is where harm is done. I copied definitions word for word until they felt plain. Heir, executor, life interest, beneficial owner. I practiced until the terms stopped sounding like weapons and started sounding like tools I could hold without shaking. I did not tell anyone that I was studying. I visited a small public library at the edge of the market because it stayed open late and the staff did not ask questions. I learned how to request gazettes and how to pull archived orders with references that most people ignore. I learned that control rarely arrives with a dramatic flourish. It arrives with a minor filing that no one challenges. It arrives with an address change that no one corrects. It arrives through a signature that looks right to a tired clerk because the day is long and the line is longer. Property records became my map. I asked for certified copies of deeds that touched our address. I learned which forms show chain of title and which forms are summaries that can hide the real story. I paid small fees in cash and kept receipts in a separate envelope. Every page received a sticky note with numbers for cross-reference. I did not chase conclusions. I chased patterns. Once a pattern emerges, the conclusion arrives on its own. Business filings were not my world, but I made them mine. I looked up the companies connected to my family name. I learned how directors change, how registered offices move, how silent partners appear when no one looks. I read balance sheets, not to judge profit, but to watch cash flow. Small transfers can reveal pressure points. Dates matter more than amounts. If a move happens the day before a signature is demanded, the move is a message. Signatures took the longest to understand. I studied how pressure differs when a person signs with confidence versus fear. I studied how the angle of a stroke changes with a different table height or a different chair. I learned what an authentic loop looks like when done slowly and what it looks like when someone copies it as art rather than habit. I learned to check where the pen lifts and where it re-enters. I learned that people forge confidence, not hesitation. Forgers draw what they think certainty looks like. Real life is messier than that. The registrar's staff noticed me after a while, not in a hostile way, more in the way people notice a regular who is always polite and always reading the fine print. One afternoon, an old clerk approached my desk with the soft shuffle of someone who has lived their whole career inside paper. He wore a white shirt with faint ink smudges on the cuffs and a pin tucked behind his ear. He did not ask why I was there. He only asked what exactly I was trying to see. I answered with care. I said I was learning how to read records the way they were meant to be read. He nodded, then told me that most people look straight at the main text and skip the margins. He said the margins speak when the center lies. He said stamps age like faces, and that the dates inside them can tell you when a page traveled through a room, not just when a form was drafted. He said the smallest mark on the back of a document can prove which desk it touched and in what order. I listened because his voice had the calm of someone who has seen every kind of trick and no longer feels surprised. He taught me to check for impressions left by a pinpoint on the page beneath, to hold a sheet against the light to see fibers disturbed by a second run through a printer, to notice whether a notary seal is embedded in the paper or pasted after. He said that documents do not only tell the truth through words. They tell it through weight, texture, and sequence. He showed me the registry logbooks, the old ones with cloth spines and heavy pages that make a small breath of dust each time they open. He taught me to track an entry number through multiple books until it ends in a volume that few people request because it looks boring. He said boredom is where the facts live. He said the loudest page in a file is often the least important. I brought him tea sometimes. He never asked for it, and he never took more than a few sips. He began to set certain files aside when he saw me in the queue. Not favors, just efficiency. He respected that I did my own reading and returned the volumes the way I found them. Trust between quiet workers forms without announcement. At home, I built a timeline on plain paper taped into a long strip. I wrote in pencil because pencil admits that knowledge can change. I placed each known transfer, each account shift, each sudden change of address. I noted when my child stopped taking calls from one aunt and started calling a different friend 3 times a week. I wrote the dates of holidays when minds are tired and people slip forms under pens. I did not allow anger to choose the order. Dates chose the order. During these years, I adopted a rule. I would not argue over what I could prove later with paper. This rule saved my energy and kept the plan clean. When I felt the old rush of pain, I would copy a page by hand. Writing calmed me. The words that stole power from me would now serve me. Each line I wrote was a slow rebuild of strength. I learned to test copies against originals by counting the dots in a particular letter. I learned to spot a scan that had been printed and rescanned to hide its first origin. I learned to keep a small magnifier in my bag to study microtext. There is a quiet thrill that comes when a file yields a truth it thought it could hide. Not the thrill of triumph. The thrill of clarity. The old clerk once told me that revenge made of anger burns the holder first. He said if I wanted real change, I should let documents speak and let the system hear. I took that lesson into my bones. I did not give speeches. I gathered proof. One evening, after a long stretch of mapping, I realized I could anticipate which document she would try to change next. Control must move to survive. It cannot sit still. If one doorway closes, it looks for a window. I prepared for the window she would choose. I placed requests in advance. I made certified copies before the next round of edits might erase what I needed. I kept everything in duplicate and hid one set in a place that does not look like a hiding place. In the 5th year of this quiet training, I requested yet another certified copy of the primary deed tied to our home. I had copies already, but the old clerk had taught me to accept that small differences can be everything. Different clerks stamp in different places. Different days produce different mistakes. I compared the new copy to the older set under the same lamp on the same table with the same ruler, because environment can fool the eye. I traced the sections with a blunt pencil. Legal description, parties, consideration, covenants, reservations, conditions. My eyes paused on the section that lists rights reserved for the original owner. I checked the older copy. The sentence I knew by rhythm had a missing breath. For words were absent in the new print. For plain words that protect occupancy for a named life and preserve control over any subdivision without written consent from that named life. The earlier copy had them. The new one did not. I held both pages up to the light and watched the difference glare back at me. The missing clause was not a printing error. The missing clause was the key. I chose a quiet return because noise had always been her strength. The invitation arrived through a cousin who asked me to stop by for a simple family dinner. Nothing formal, just food and old songs. I agreed with a steady yes. I pressed my palms together, breathed once, and folded into the role I had built for years. Polite, present, easy to overlook. I wore a soft color that blends into rooms. I fixed a light shawl at the shoulders and placed a small dessert on a tray. My bag held spoons, napkins, and one thumb drive inside a plain envelope that looked like a receipt. She greeted me at the door with that polished smile that never reaches the deeper places. I returned the smile with a smaller one and offered the dessert to her father, who thanked me too loudly as though gratitude required volume to be true. My child came from the kitchen and hugged me with a warmth that hurt. I held on for a heartbeat and then let go because staying one breath longer would have exposed the reason I came. The evening moved through predictable notes. Someone praised the new paint. Someone else teased an uncle about his sugar intake. A neighbor stopped by with flowers that she placed in a vase without looking at me. I found a chair that was neither outside the circle nor inside it. I poured water for elders, refilled plates for the youngest, answered questions about health and old friends. I told short stories that ended quickly so that my words would not gather weight. I needed her to keep seeing me as harmless. I needed the room to hold its usual rhythm. At the center of the table lay her phone, face down, screen pulsing softly when messages arrived. She kept her palm near it, a reflex she could not hide. My child sat beside her, careful in posture, less at ease than before, eyes heavy from weeks of tense nights. I kept my voice soft when I spoke to both of them. I did not seek openings. I let openings arrive. The dessert finished and laughter touched the edges of the room. She excused herself to check a timer for a dish in the oven. I stood to help and she waved me off with a bright kindness that acts like a hand on the shoulder. I kept moving anyway, but not toward the kitchen. I moved toward the small study near the corridor where guests hang their coats. The door was half open. Inside sat a neat desk, a slim laptop stand, a bowl for keys, a pen holder that looked unused, and a thin stack of manila folders. Every surface seemed composed for a photograph. I placed my shawl on the chair and pretended to look for a tissue. Then I knelt to tie a lace that did not need tying. I slid the plain envelope from my bag and placed it under the edge of the laptop stand where the shadow makes a clean line. If a person pulled the stand forward, the envelope would fall with a soft whisper. If the person lifted the stand, the envelope would remain. Stuck until gravity asked a question. I stood, adjusted the shawl, and returned to the hall with a tissue in hand that I had taken from my own bag. I did not rush. Rushing is a confession. She returned from the kitchen at the same moment, carrying a tray of baked vegetables, steam rising in a calm ribbon. Our eyes met for a second. I kept my gaze steady, friendly, untroubled. She looked past me, set the tray down, and announced that we should all eat while it was hot. Conversations shifted. Chairs scraped. Plates moved. A young cousin asked me to taste a new sauce. I said it was good and meant it. I gave truth to the room so that the lie of my invisibility would breathe. When the table settled, she began her ritual of planning the next month in front of everyone. She asked who would host on which weekend. She allocated chores as if she carried a small council in her head. People nodded because coordinated plans feel like care, and care is easy to accept when it comes in tidy lists. I listened and made 2 mental notes. One date held a pattern I knew well. She always shifted funds the day before a trip to her parents. Another date matched a filing window at the registry. She believed her system ran on fixed rails. I had learned the switches. My child tried to catch my eye twice during the planning, then failed to hold it. The distance between us could not be crossed in public. That is what control does best. It makes love look like a risk. I turned to the oldest person at the table and asked about a childhood memory I had heard 100 times. The story rolled out like a soft blanket and covered the chill that had begun to creep into the corners. I let the story run its course. I wanted her to feel the room at ease. People who hunt feel safest when the forest sings. After dinner, the men argued about a match on television and the women followed a recipe debate toward the sink. I stood near the doorway to the study again, not entering, only passing. I looked at the family photographs on the wall. In one frame, she stood beside my child on a beach, hair pushed back by wind, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, chin lifted with a small defiance that says victory before the game begins. In another, my child stood with a shy half-smile I had known since childhood. I placed my hand flat against my heart to steady it. A phone buzzed. She stepped into the study to answer it because the corridor has better reception. I kept walking past the door and turned toward the washroom. The call ended quickly. I heard the soft drag of the laptop stand as she adjusted a cable. A pause. A soft paper sound. I did not look. I washed my hands and returned to the living room with a towel that did not belong to me. I apologized, folded it neatly, and placed it back. The room accepted the small error. No one noticed what mattered. She did not come back for several minutes. When she returned, her face was clear, as if nothing had touched her mood. She picked up her phone and placed it in her pocket. The envelope did not show in her hand, which meant it had gone into a drawer or under a stack of folders. Either way, the room inside her head would not be quiet tonight. A single unknown element can make an empire twitch. I helped with dishes and spoke about weather, a topic that carries emotion without inviting confession. She thanked me for the dessert and said we should do these dinners more often. I said yes with the same warmth I would give to a prayer. My child walked me to the gate. We stood under the light. I asked about sleep. The answer was a shrug shaped like a smile. I touched their arm and said I would call in the morning. I did not say which morning. Leaving spaces in sentences can carry more weight than full stops. The night air had a clean edge. I walked home slowly to keep my mind still. On the way, I reviewed the steps that remained. The files, the old clause, the bank trail, the witness I had not used. Patience held each point like beads on a single thread, not for beauty, but for order. When I reached my door, I set my keys on the table and sat for a long time with the light off. I wanted the quiet to grow strong inside me again. I drank water, opened my notebook, and added a simple line. The return occurred without friction. Envelope placed. Response unknown. Wait. At her house, the rooms thinned out one by one as guests left, voices softened, shoes tapped down the steps, a latch clicked, and the hallway stretched into that late silence houses have when only owners remain. In the study, she slid the chair under the desk and hesitated. She looked at the stack of folders arranged with their spines aligned. She closed the door, turned the lock, and drew the laptop closer. The stand moved. Her hand paused. She reached under the front edge and found the envelope, a slip of thin weight that should not have been there. Her first impulse was to throw it away. Control hates unknown inputs. But curiosity is the twin of fear, and both pull at the same nerve. She broke the seal cleanly. Inside, she found the small black thumb drive. No label. No brand. A blank face that reflected the desk lamp. She did not call my child. She did not call her lawyer. Pride does not like witnesses at the altar of doubt. She opened the laptop and waited for the desktop to load. She inserted the drive. The cursor turned to a circle for a breath, and then stilled. A single folder appeared, then opened on its own. One file sat in the center of the screen. No cover letter. No instructions. Only a name in plain type, patient and cold. The summons arrived at noon when the street was drowsy and the sun drew a pale stripe on the gate. The courier did not smile. He asked for my name, checked the label twice, and handed me the stiff envelope that felt heavier than paper should feel. I thanked him and closed the door with a quiet latch. I did not open it in the hallway. I walked to the small table by the window, placed the envelope flat, and stood for a moment to let my breath even out. Then I broke the seal and slid the notice free. The words were measured and cold. Appearance required. Date set. Court named. Case title listed with a precision that looked almost polite. I read every line. Then read the tiny print below that most eyes skip. The notice included a list of documents expected. That part made the room tilt by a single degree. Whoever drafted this knew the path I had built with care. Someone had guessed that I would come prepared. I folded the paper once and placed it back in the envelope. My phone buzzed before I could stand. A cousin had already heard. News moves faster than ink. By the time I reached the kitchen, 2 more messages sat on the screen. One offered prayer. One asked what went wrong. I poured water, drank, and answered none. People try to help with noise. I needed quiet that day. My child arrived before evening, face tight, shoulders stiff from tension carried for too many nights. I showed the envelope without commentary. They read it slowly, lips pressed into a line that had become more common these past months. They placed the notice on the counter and asked how I wanted to proceed. I said the plan had not changed. I would go where the documents take me. No more. No less. They nodded, but the nod did not reach their eyes. She entered an hour later, crisp, composed, not even pretending surprise. She scanned the notice, then lifted her gaze to mine with calm that tried to pass for innocence. She said the timing felt strange, as if some clerk had acted without understanding the full picture. I watched the confidence in her posture and knew she had already spoken to someone. People who move money for sport do not wait for luck. They buy timing and call it fate. By nightfall, the family group chat had split into 2 currents. One current framed the case as an unfortunate misunderstanding that would be fixed with a short visit to the court. The other current warned me to drop it for the sake of harmony. No one asked what the document said. People fear paper more than they fear shouting. Paper gives form to guilt. Paper outlives gossip. I slept for 2 hours and then woke with the kind of clarity that comes only when a long plan finally steps into daylight. I laid out the timeline on the floor, each page secured with tape so a draft from the window would not scatter years across the room. I arranged certified copies on the left and working copies on the right. In the middle, I placed the deed set, old and new, with the missing clause circled in pencil so the circle could be erased and drawn again if I changed my mind about the angle of attack. I wrote a short list titled in my head, not on the page, "What Speaks Without Me?" Morning brought the only ally who had never tried to turn my fear into advice. The old clerk reached my door wearing the same white shirt with faint ink marks and the same careful step. He said the registry had received a request yesterday that had moved my file to a different shelf. He did not say who signed the request. He did not need to. I thanked him and poured tea. He sat, sipped once, and began to talk in that quiet way that makes space for thought to sit between sentences. He taught me a final lesson for the courtroom. He said to let the record walk on its own legs. He said the judge would care less about my pain and more about sequence. He said to hold my story until the papers had spoken, then speak only to connect the last 2 dots. He warned me that cross-examination would try to make me rush. He told me to answer short questions with short answers and long questions with requests for clarity. He said it with a small smile that showed he had watched many strong cases drown in the flood of a witness who wanted to tell everything. At once, I packed a folder with the spine labeled in pencil for speed. I used colored tabs to mark the burdens that belonged to them, not to me. I was not there to prove a feeling. I was there to point at proof. I kept 1 more copy of the old deed in a separate envelope in the lining of my bag. I taped a thin magnifier to a card and slid it into a book so it would not be obvious during security checks. Small steps, visible to no one, make a wall that even a storm respects. Calls kept coming. An aunt cried on the phone and said hearts would break if this reached the news. An uncle asked me to meet a friend who could mediate quietly for a small fee. A cousin warned me that lawyers twist everything and that I should trust the family to solve family things. I thanked each person with the same steady line. I will go where the documents take me. The line worked like a shield. She moved through the day like a conductor, gathering sympathy, arranging rides, offering to handle logistics so no one else would feel burdened. People praised her calm. People often mistake a steady voice for a clean soul. She asked me if I needed help finding counsel. I told her I already had someone in mind. She lifted a brow and gave a light laugh that said I was charming even when stubborn. That laugh had been her knife for years. I met Salman just after noon in a small office that smelled of old paper and iron keys. He wore no tie. His shelves held more files than books. He read my notes without interrupting, then read them again, then set them down and asked no questions. He only requested the stack of certified copies and the original set of the old deed that showed the clause I had found. He looked at the clause for a full minute without speaking. Then he tapped the margin twice with a blunt finger and said very softly that the case would rise or fall on this line and on the custody of these copies. He did not make promises. He made a plan. He would file to freeze any transfer attempts until the first hearing. He would request the registry logs that matched the day the clause went missing. He would ask for the print sequence and the machine ID if the office still kept that record. He would call the clerk who loved dust more than drama and ask him to bring the old logbook that lists cross-references no one uses. He said he would handle the court. He said I would handle my voice. He trained me in one session. Eyes on the judge. Answers shaped like steps, not like songs. Dates first. Page number second. Sentences without embroidery. If asked about pain, return to paper. If accused of bitterness, return to sequence. If pushed to speak about motive, say I want only what the record shows. He said that good cross-examiners feed on adjectives. He told me to speak in nouns and verbs. By evening, the house felt like a waiting room. My child sat by the window, phone in hand, face pale with a guilt that did not belong to them alone. I sat beside them and did nothing wise. I only placed my hand on theirs for a count of 10 and then got up to pack my bag. Love sometimes is presence that refuses to bargain. Near midnight, a message arrived on the family chat that ended all pretense. A relative posted a link to a news clip featuring a sleek figure outside the court, famous for sharp suits and sharper cross-exams. The caption said the name in bold letters. I watched the short video. The attorney smiled at the camera with that smooth respect that turns into cruelty once the oath begins. Stories about this person traveled through legal circles like warnings on storm maps. People said witnesses left the stand feeling smaller than their shoes. I looked at the screen for a long breath and felt a wave pass through me that was not fear and not pride. It was the simple knowledge that the room I had been building in my head was about to become real. She had hired the one counsel known for destroying witnesses, not cases. That choice told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to win. She would try to break my voice, not my proof. I set the phone, face down, turned off the light, and lay awake in the dark with my hand on the folder. The clock moved. The house settled. Somewhere across town, her new attorney drafted questions designed to make memory look like malice. I closed my eyes and repeated the only rule that still mattered. Let the documents speak. Let me be the echo. The courtroom felt colder than the morning outside, even with the press of bodies on the wooden benches. The walls smelled faintly of paper and varnish. I sat at the witness stand with my folder on my knees, palms dry, voice ready. The clerk swore me in. The oath tasted like metal. Across the well, her attorney rose with that practiced calm that makes most people shrink before the first question lands. He did not look at my documents. He looked at me, as if people are easier to dismantle than paper. He opened with my age, my health, my sleep, my appetite. He asked about headaches, about lost items, about moments when I misplaced keys. He asked if I talk to myself when I am alone. He asked whether I write notes for feelings I cannot speak. He asked if I ever raised my voice at home. He asked if I ever cried in the past year. Each question skipped the case and nudged at my stability. I answered without embroidery. Yes. No. Sometimes. I did not decorate the air with extra words. The judge watched the rhythm like a metronome that waits for a misstep. He shifted to timelines. He repeated dates with a spin that made 2 years sound like 2 months. He asked if I might have confused one winter with another. He asked if I had ever mistaken a neighbor's visit for a relative's. He asked whether I understood that memory bends under grief. I told him I brought certified copies for the dates that matter. He smiled the way people smile when they feel a hook catch and they think they own the line. He said we would get to documents soon, and that for now the court needed to weigh how much faith to place in my recollection. The word faith floated in the air like perfume and then sank. He placed a photograph on the ledge. It showed me at a family gathering, half-turned, mid-laugh. He asked if I looked frail or strong in that picture. I said the picture showed a moment, not a measure. He asked if I agreed that I have had difficult months. I said yes. He asked if I agreed that difficult months can blur judgment. I said that is why I brought records. He paused. The room leaned forward a fraction. He slid a stack of receipts across the ledge, receipts for groceries and repairs and small household things. He asked if I could identify each one by memory. I said no. He asked if I could identify any one of them by memory. I said yes. He asked me to pick one. I chose the oldest and read it aloud. He asked how I remembered that one. I said the purchase happened on a day a storm cut power and we ate early by candlelight. He asked if I wrote that story after the fact to make a receipt feel important. I said the story wrote itself before I had a pen. He asked about my relationship with my child. He asked if I ever resented growing distance. He asked whether I provoked arguments to regain control. He asked if I had ever told my child that their partner would destroy our house. I said I had spoken with care. He asked if that meant yes. I told him I had spoken with care and that my words are in my notebook if he wished to see the exact line. He declined. He preferred fog when he could not control the light. He called me obsessive. He used the word method repeatedly, as if method is a flaw. He suggested that my time in the registry had become a hobby that filled a hole left by grief. He suggested that I chased shadows and found shapes I wanted to find. He suggested that my notes looked like the work of someone who cannot let go. He asked if I wanted the house back, because losing it felt like losing myself. I said I want only what the record shows. The judge glanced down, maybe at a calendar, maybe to keep the room from mistaking theater for truth. He asked about the clause. His tone softened. He asked if I accepted that copies can differ due to scanning errors. I said minor variations occur. He asked if I accepted that a sentence can be dropped by a machine and later restored without any ill intent. I said machines do drop lines. He asked if I accepted that this could be such a case. I said that is why the logbook matters, because sequence does not care about intent. He smiled again, then closed the folder as if he had led me where he wanted me to stand. He moved to the missing clause. He said 4 words can vanish without malice. He said the deed still names all parties. He said the effect is minimal since the property sits in the same place, and the roof has not moved. He asked if I understood that law cares about substance. I said those 4 words hold the key to occupancy, subdivision, and control. He said I exaggerate. I said the old copy and the new copy disagree, and that I have both. He asked the judge to instruct me to answer questions rather than lecture. The judge asked him to ask questions that invite answers. The room breathed. He tried a new angle. He asked if I had ever misplaced a statement. I said yes. He asked if I had ever thrown out a letter by accident. I said yes. He asked if I had ever torn a page from my notebook out of shame at a thought I did not want to keep. I said yes. He asked if it is possible that I misread the clause earlier and only later saw what I wanted to see. I said no. He asked how I could be so certain. I said the pen impressions on the old copy align with a specific stamp from a specific day that matches the registry log. He set his jaw the way hunters do when the brush rustles, and the shape that emerges is not prey. He reached for temperature again. He asked about my late nights. He asked whether I hear sounds in the house when no one is there. He asked if I believe in signs. He asked if I ever pray for outcomes. He asked if I think my prayers guide my eyes to words that favor me. I told him prayer keeps me patient, not blind. He nodded like someone who has trained a witness to appear stubborn at just the right moment. He was about to move on when Salman stood with a single page in his hand. He requested permission to show me a document from the bank that had been disclosed late. The attorney objected on timing. Salman replied that the statement had arrived that morning from a third party and that it touched a transfer referenced by the cross-examiner himself. The judge allowed a brief look. I held the page. It was a bank statement from the company I had never heard of, the one that had appeared on a receipt months before. The date lined up with a change in the deed sequence. A small transfer left one account the night before the missing clause first appeared. The destination matched an account in her name with a suffix that never showed on family records. The amount was not large. It did not need to be. It marked a path. Small stones still build a road. Her attorney leaned in to see. He kept his face smooth, but the corners of his mouth pulled tight for a breath he thought no one would see. He objected again, called it irrelevant, said we were here to discuss ink on property paper, not transactions too small to matter. Salman asked to mark the page for identification and tie it later to sequence. The judge agreed. The jury of benches murmured. The cross-examiner attempted repair. He asked if I knew that small businesses move funds in strange ways. I said I did not know their habits, only the dates. He asked if I saw that the amount could be a fee. I said it could be many things, and that is why the logbook matters. He asked if I believed her capable of moving documents and money in concert. I said I believe in patterns, not in character labels. He let the question fall. He did not want the word capable to linger in the air like a stake. He closed with a final try at my mind. He asked if I felt persecuted. I said I felt responsible. He asked if I believe my family owes me a debt that law cannot define. I said my family owes me nothing but truth. He asked if I would accept loss if the record did not support me. I said yes. He asked if I would accept peace if the record did. I said yes. The judge watched my face the way one watches a candle to see if a draft will show. He took his seat. The room exhaled. The judge leaned forward and tapped the missing clause on the exhibit copy with the eraser end of a pencil. Then the judge looked at the old deed and the new deed, at the stamp placement, at the margins where time leaves its signature under the signatures. The voice that followed was measured, neither warm nor cold. Handwriting verification, the judge said. Both sets. All signatures claimed. Independent examiner. Registry logbooks to travel under seal. The court will hear from the hands themselves. The house felt split down the middle, though no one drew a line on the floor. Calls came in clusters. Some relatives whispered comfort and told me to stay calm. Others spoke in careful tones that sounded like warning. One aunt said the court would only make things ugly, and that families should heal without judges. An uncle sent a voice message about respect, which in his language meant surrender. I listened to all of it and wrote nothing back for hours. Words said in heat do not carry well. Paper still waited on my table, steady and cool. At dinner, my child sat with a fork that never quite reached the plate. The silence between us had changed shape. Before, it felt like distance. Now it felt like pressure. The hearing date loomed, and the judge had asked for hands to speak on paper. That order sharpened everything. My child stared at the window, then looked at me as if choosing a side meant choosing a parent. I said no side needs to be chosen if truth chooses us. It was not a clever line. It was a hope that tasted thin. Relatives began to visit in pairs, as if numbers could move my position. One cousin told me that I had always been strong, which sounded kind until they asked me to be strong by stepping back. A second cousin said that neighbors gossip and employers listen, and that my child would suffer if this reached headlines. They pretended this was concern for me. I thanked them for coming, poured tea, and walked them to the gate. When I returned, I placed 2 new entries in my notebook. Who tries to end a fire by smothering smoke, and who brings water. The old clerk called to tell me the logbooks were sealed and ready to travel under court order. His voice steadied me. He spoke about ink density and pencil hardness and the way bindings reveal which pages are replacements. He did not speak about love or loyalty. He spoke about things that can be measured. After I ended the call, my child asked me if I believed evidence can heal a home. I said evidence can stop harm. Healing is another kind of work. Messages from her side of the family carried a different tone. They used words like peace and unity. They framed the case as a simple misunderstanding. They said she had always been generous, that she had supported my child through hard seasons, that she paid bills on time and kept the house running. All true, in fragments. They lifted the clean pieces and hid the rest under rugs woven with compliments. I did not correct them. You cannot argue a story out of a chorus that only knows one melody. At night, I heard the wind touch the gate and imagined the courtroom doors opening. I pictured her attorney walking the floor like a stage. I thought of my late spouse, of quiet evenings at this same table, of laughter that does not return when homes split inside a whisper. I felt the ache and refused to make it my compass. Pain points in every direction at once. The day came when the judge called for witness lists. Salman spread forms across his desk and spoke in a tone that kept my pulse slow. He said my child would be called. The words sat between us like a stone that both of us hoped to avoid. My child looked at me and then at the floor. They said they were not ready. They said they feared being used as a tool. They said they did not want to be the knife that cuts this family for good. Salman did not push. He explained that testimony can be short, precise, and limited to facts. He said we would request narrow scope if needed. My child nodded without promise. That evening, a small group came to the house with prepared phrases. They said the judge would not be kind to a parent who drags a child into a fight. They said the law looks cold at feelings. They said I would lose the last piece of love I still held. Someone pressed my hand and said I had lived long enough to know when to bow. I looked at the faces around me and saw fear dressed as wisdom. I asked if any of them had read the deed. No one answered. I asked if any of them had held the old copy and felt the weight of the missing words. Silence filled the room like dust in a sunbeam. People blink when dust stings. They do not stay to clean it. After they left, my child stood in the doorway and asked if I would forgive them for not testifying. I said forgiveness is not a ticket. It is a light that stays on in the hall, even when the door is closed. I told them I would not force them to stand where they cannot stand. I told them I would still walk into court. My child nodded once and went to their room. I sat at the table and stared at the seam in the wood where two planks meet. It looked like a map of every split that had brought us here. She called late. I almost let it ring into the dark. I answered. Her voice was calm in a way that wanted to pour oil over water. She said the family had suffered enough. She said my child was not well. She said the court would end in shame. She said she would agree to a private settlement if I withdrew. I asked her to state the terms in writing. She laughed softly, as if I had asked for the moon. She said there are things one should not write. The line hung. I let it drop. The next morning, my child did not come out for breakfast. I left a plate by the door and a note that said only the hearing time and a small heart. I do not draw hearts often. That day I did. I spent the afternoon at Salman's office reviewing the order for the handwriting expert. He walked me through the chain of custody for signatures. He showed me how the court marks exhibits so no one can swap pages. He was meticulous without being proud of it. He treated care as a duty, not a virtue. I returned home to 3 missed calls from unknown numbers and 1 message from a relative asking me to visit a healer. I smiled without humor, put the phone down, and washed my hands. As I dried them, a new voice message appeared from a number I knew. I set the phone face down and counted to 20. Then I pressed play. Her voice filled the kitchen, low and steady. She spoke my name like a verdict. She said the court does not have to be the only room where truth lives. She said secrets do not always stay buried. She asked if I remembered the winter 10 years ago when money ran out and a loan appeared without paperwork. She asked if I remembered who brought that envelope and what favor was asked in return. She said names can surface in public when papers begin to talk. She said that if I continued this path, she would tell everyone what I did to protect this family, and she would make sure my child heard it from her, not from me. I stood very still and felt the past step into the present with muddy feet. The winter she named had teeth. I remembered the night the lights went off and the pantry felt like an empty cupboard in a stranger's house. I remembered an envelope of cash placed on this same table by a person with a careful smile and a condition that I never accepted but never reported. I remembered how shame tastes when it is swallowed for survival. I had said nothing then because I believed silence could keep a roof steady. That silence now had come back with interest. She continued. She said she would share copies of messages that would make me look like a schemer. She said she would call relatives and spill pieces in a way that turned my patience into plotting. She said my time in the registry could be painted as fixation. She said I might hold paper, but she held the crowd. She ended with a small sigh, the kind people use when they pretend to feel pity. Then the message clicked off. I replayed it once, not to hurt myself, but to hear if there was tremor under the calm. There was. Not much. Just a thread. Fear knows how to hide, but it cannot leave a voice completely clean. I forwarded the audio to Salman with a single line. Received at 7:43 p.m. Potential witness tampering. He replied with 1 word. Noted. My child walked into the kitchen while I still held the phone. Their face carried a question and a plea. I did not share the audio. I asked if they had decided about testifying. They said not yet. I nodded. I did not tell them that pressure had shifted shapes again. I set a glass of water on the table and placed the phone face down beside it. Then I said we would reach the court together after all, even if only one of us spoke. My child looked at me and tried to smile. The smile broke at the edges. Night settled. The house creaked in its usual places. In my room, I placed the phone next to the folder and wrote a single line in my notebook. Lies carry weight, but so does silence kept for the wrong reason. I closed the book and turned off the light. The voicemail waited, small and dark on the screen, like a seed that had just touched soil. I returned to the old house on a weekday afternoon when the lane is quiet and the shopkeepers across the road count coins instead of watching gates. The key still turned in the lock, though the metal felt rough against my fingers, as if time had been chewing at the teeth. The door opened to a smell I knew by heart: wood polish, dust after sun, a faint trace of my late spouse's soap that somehow lives in hinges and curtains. I stood inside the foyer and let the silence settle on my shoulders like a shawl. I did not walk through the rooms as a guest. I moved the way a person moves in a place that once breathed for them. My steps knew where the floor dips and where the boards creak. I did not switch on all the lights. I chose one lamp in the sitting room, the one with the thin shade, so the glow stayed soft and the windows did not advertise my return. I closed the curtains to a careful line. Dust hung in the beam like small planets. The bookshelf stood where it always has, tall, steady, a darker patch on the wall showing where it has guarded the paint from sun. People think safes hide behind paintings or under rugs. My late spouse did not trust cliches. The shelf had been built to look old, but the screws were newer than the wood. We had chosen the carpenter together. I remembered the day my spouse laughed about secret places no one respects because they look like heavy work. I set my bag down, rolled my sleeves, and ran my palm along the side of the shelf until I found the shallow notch near the base. I pushed first. Nothing. I pulled gently. The frame did not move, but a small give answered from the back panel, the kind of answer you feel in bone more than in hand. There is a sequence to this, I told myself, and then I let memory lead. My spouse had shown me once, long ago, on a rainy afternoon full of tea and soft music. 3 small actions: lift, tilt, press. I lifted the right edge by the thickness of a coin, tilted forward 2 fingers' breadth, then pressed the left inner post exactly where a knot in the wood looks like an eye. The click was so soft I almost missed it. The shelf released its weight from the wall and pivoted on a hidden hinge with a slow, reluctant sigh. Behind it, a shallow niche held. A safe that sat flush with the plaster. No keypad. No digital face to betray an era. Just a steel door with a keyhole and a dial. I ran a cloth across the metal and watched a line of clean gray appear. I took my seat on the floor and placed the small notebook on my knee. The combination lived in that notebook, encoded in a recipe from the year we bought our first car. The numbers were not numbers on the page. They were amounts of ingredients. My spouse had always loved building memory into ordinary things, so no thief could find treasure without learning our ways. I turned the dial slowly. Left to the first number, right to the second, left to the third. I stopped at each tick like a person stepping stones across a creek. Then I used the old key that lived on a ring under a loose tile near the window, another habit my spouse had trained into me. The safe opened with a weighty whisper, the kind of sound that tells you the world inside is private and intends to stay that way. Inside lay flat envelopes, a wrapped drive, and 3 hardbound notebooks with our initials. I did not rush. I lifted each item with both hands, set them on a folded cloth, and checked the back wall of the safe for hidden compartments. My spouse never repeated a trick. The interior was plain. I placed the envelopes on the carpet and chose the one marked in our careful hand. House, primary. A thin line under the word primary had a second line beside it, lighter, as if the pen had scratched the surface without leaving ink. I knew that habit too. It meant, look twice. I opened the envelope. Inside, there were certified copies of the deed with stamps from years ago, not the ones I had obtained recently. I placed them beside the newer copies from my bag and checked sequence, page numbers, line spacing. Then I moved to the margins where the registry mark lives. The older stamp showed where that matched the logbook date the clerk had promised to bring under seal. The missing clause stood full and firm, not a ghost. The punctuation after the clause was a comma in the old copy, a period in the newer one. People who edit truths forget that syntax keeps footprints. The second envelope held witness statements from neighbors who had moved away, each page signed, each signature witnessed by a notary my spouse trusted in the old market. I recognized the notary's offset seal, slightly crooked because of a fracture in his stamp handle. I remembered teasing him about it once and his promise to fix it when business slowed. Business never slows when people tell lies for sport. The crooked seal became his signature more than his name did. The third envelope carried a surprise. It contained 3 photographs of our deed at the registry counter taken years earlier on a small point-and-shoot camera. In the frame, you could see the hands of the clerk turning the page, the top of the ledger, and the guide card that indicates which volume follows which. The date strip on the edge matched the logbook year. The guide card number matched an index one had cross-referenced last month. My spouse had not trusted memory alone. Proof lived in pictures too. I turned to the wrap drive. A small label, Ledger Crossref. I did not have a laptop with me. I would not risk plugging it into any device in this house. I placed it back in the cloth with a note in my head to scan it later in a clean environment. I set the drive aside and opened the first hardbound notebook. My spouse's handwriting leaned forward as if the letters were walking. The entries mixed the ordinary and the careful. Power bill noted next to a citation from a case. A shopping list next to a diagram of stamp placements on our deed. In the margin, a simple line. If anything happens to me, the book answers in sequence. I kept reading until a small square of tracing paper slid out. On it, a pencil rubbing of a signature that was not mine. The strokes showed pressure where the pen meets doubt, a common tell in copies made without confidence. Under the rubbing, a line in my spouse's hand, reference against any future transfer. Watch the S-loop. I placed the rubbing over the recent copy and held both to the lamp. The loop shape did not match. The forged loop held a perfect oval, as if drawn by a compass. The genuine loop had a slight wobble at the top, the human kind that comes when a hand lifts to take a breath. I felt a small heat in my chest. Not anger. Recognition. I took photographs of everything with a phone that never touches my regular accounts. I dated each image by voice into the recorder and spoke the time so the record would carry both forms of memory. I sealed the envelopes again with fresh tape and returned them to the safe in the same order. Then I lifted the second notebook. Inside, a list of registry staff names from that period, with small marks next to the few who had been moved to other districts. Next to one name, my spouse had drawn a star and written, "Keeps clean ledgers. Count on sequence." I recognized the name. The old clerk's mentor. I checked the last notebook and found something I did not expect. Fingerprints. My spouse had pressed a thumb on a strip of tape, lifted it, and placed it on a white card next to his signature. Under it, the note said, "Control sample, mine." On the next page, another strip, labeled with the initials of a registry clerk who had voluntarily provided a sample for a project my spouse had mentioned years ago. The label said, "With consent." My spouse believed in doing things the right way. I ran a finger along the edge of the card and felt the raised grain where tape had once peeled away from skin. Proof does not always shout. Sometimes it breathes under glue. The house settled around me, with ticking softly as temperature changed. I heard a scooter cough past the gate and fade. I checked my watch. I had been inside for just under an hour. Enough for this trip. I returned the notebooks to the safe, closed the door, turned the dial back to 0, and slid the shelf into place with the same slow care. The click felt like a heartbeat returning to its usual pace. Before I left, I stood in the kitchen and opened the small drawer where we kept things that do not belong anywhere else. Inside lay an old ink pad, dried at the corners but still usable in the middle, and a packet of clear tape. I placed both in my bag. On the counter, I found an old glass, washed it, and left it upside down to dry, a habit from a time when we believed water on rims attracts dust. I locked the door, stepped into the afternoon, and walked the lane without looking back. Twice, I felt that quiet tug that tells you someone is watching. I did not turn. People who watch hope for a reaction. Denying them the theater is its own kind of safety. At home, I set the bag on the table and called Salman. I told him I had the older certified copies with the intact claws, photographs of the registry counter, and a control set of fingerprints from my spouse, labeled and dated. He was silent for a breath that felt longer than it was. Then he said we would add the images to the exhibit list, mark the notebooks for chain of custody, and present the rubbings under the light for the examiner. He asked me to bring the ink pad and tape. He did not say why. He did not need to. The court had ordered handwriting verification. Sometimes hands tell stories that mouths try to hide. I ended the call and placed the tracing paper over the recent deed once more. I traced the S-loop with my eye until the difference started to feel like a physical gap I could fall through. I imagined the examiner's lab, the lenses, the magnifiers, the angled lights. I imagined the report that would speak without adjectives. I imagined the witness stand where truth walks in boots and does not dress for applause. I slid the rubbing back into the notebook and closed it with both palms. Then I wrote a single line on a fresh page in my own hand. The line did not ask for victory. It asked for sequence to speak. When I put the pen down, I saw the smallest smudge on the recent deed copy, near the signature that should have been mine. I reached for the tape and pressed it gently to the smudge, lifted it, and pressed it to a white card. Under a lamp, a faint ridge pattern appeared, incomplete, but there. I placed my spouse's control card beside it. The ridges did not match. The courtroom filled early, a low hum running under the wooden beams like a wire undercurrent. I sat behind Salman with my folder squared to the table edge. Across the aisle, she entered in a dark suit and a calm face that had carried her through years of tidy control. Her attorney nodded to the clerk and set down a briefcase as if placing a chess piece. I kept my eyes on the judge's bench. Timing would control the day, not posture. The judge took the seat, adjusted the stack of files, and signaled for the handwriting examiner. The examiner walked with an even step, carried 2 slim cases, and spoke in a voice that kept all air steady. The oath ended, and the lights above the side table brightened. The clerk laid the old deed, the recent deed, and the trace overlays under a glass screen. The examiner held a magnifier and began with method, not theory. Lens angle, pen lifts, entry points, exit points, pressure spread. At each point, the examiner referenced the registry log and the stamp sequence to anchor the work in time. The loop on the S did not match. The pen pressure under the second half of my name did not match. The stagger of the capital did not match. The examiner pointed to minute tremors in the forged version that suggested imitation rather than habit. The older copy bore shallow interruptions where a person breathes. The newer copy bore bold strokes, shaped by imitation, then smoothed by a confident hand. The judge watched without comment. I watched her attorney as the line of his mouth flattened by a hair's width each time the examiner said, "Observe difference." Salman rose and asked for the tracing paper my spouse had made years ago. The clerk placed it on the glass. The examiner aligned it with the old deed and nodded, then aligned it with the new deed and paused. The differences clicked into a grid under the lens. The examiner requested the fingerprints card. The clerk handed over the control card from my spouse's notebook and the tape lift from the recent deed. The examiner placed them under angled light. The pattern did not match. The examiner explained ridge flow, bifurcations, and a partial that excludes rather than proves. No drama, only sequence. The judge marked the finding. Her attorney stood. He asked whether poor lighting or a worn pen could produce the tremor. The examiner explained that tremor born of age has a pattern, while tremor born of imitation has a different signature. He asked if a scan error could stretch a loop. The examiner said scan distortion influences all lines uniformly and cannot explain selective strength at a point of hesitation. He asked if an assistant could have filled a page by mistake. The examiner said an assistant does not leave another person's ridges on the page. The judge moved on. Salman called the old clerk. He wore a clean shirt and carried a logbook like someone who carries a child. He spoke about entry numbers, cross-references, and the shelf order that does not change without a signed instruction. He identified the day when the deed was duplicated for a copy set and the day when a new run appeared. He described the seal pattern the printer leaves on the back edge of each page. He explained why a comma became a period when a person with a heavy hand leaned on a fresh block. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at her. He spoke to the ledger and the judge. Her attorney tried to bend him. He asked if he trusted his memory over 15 years. The clerk said he trusted the log. He asked if the clerk cared for me in a way that colors vision. The clerk said he cares for paper. He asked whether a supervisor could have ordered a change. The clerk said such an order leaves a ticket, and there is no ticket. The judge noted the absence. We moved to emails. Salman placed a stack of prints on the rail and asked the court to read only the headers for now. Dates aligned with registry visits. A message from her to her attorney's office flagged. Time-sensitive property correction, 2 days before the missing clause first appeared. Another message from a personal account to a third party bore the subject. Confirm receipt of documents. The body text had one line. As discussed. For today, her attorney objected to interpretation. Salman agreed. He said the dates alone speak. We moved to transfers. The bank statement from the small company showed a movement of funds the night before the registry print. Then a mirror amount landed in an account suffix in her name that does not appear in family disclosures. The amounts were modest. The timing was not. Another statement months later showed a similar pair around the date of a notary appointment that should have included me, but did not. Salman placed the pages in a row like stepping stones across a creek. The judge followed with a finger and nodded for the next. The room listened harder when Salman produced the photographs from the old camera, the ones my spouse had taken at the registry counter. In those frames, time stood still. The clerk at the desk wore a bandage on the finger that matched an entry in the duty roster notes about a slip with a stamp blade that week. The ledger guide card number matched the one in the log. In the margin of one photo, the year strip showed a line that the later printer model does not produce. Details that cannot be faked unless a person asks time itself to lie. Her attorney objected that the photos were ancient and irrelevant. Salman replied that the photos set a baseline for what the deed looked like before the clause vanished. The judge allowed them, limited in scope. In the gallery, someone coughed, then thought better of a second cough. Each piece of proof took its place, and each place connected to the next. The chain did not strain. It held. She began to sit forward, then back, then forward again, a pendulum of careful control. Her knuckles paled when she folded her hands. She watched her attorney and tried to borrow his calm. Calm does not transfer when foundation shifts under both chairs. Her attorney rose for cross on the examiner again. He pushed pace. He asked 5 questions in the space of 3. The examiner refused the speed by answering one at a time. He asked whether bias exists in all experts. The examiner said bias lives everywhere, which is why labs write procedures. He asked if a different expert could disagree. The examiner said another expert could use other words and find the same shapes. The judge moved to the next witness. Salman called me. I walked to the stand with no paper in my hands. My folder remained on the table. He asked how the old notebooks came to be in my possession. I said my late spouse left them in a safe built behind a shelf that we commissioned together. He asked why I did not bring them before. I said I had not opened the safe in years and returned when the order for handwriting verification made the contents necessary. He asked if I had altered any page. I said no. He asked if I wanted the house out of spite. I said I wanted only the record to govern what the record already governed. He asked nothing else. Her attorney stood and began with tone. He asked if I remembered the winter when money ran out. My chest tightened once, then settled. He asked if I had accepted a cash envelope without paperwork. I said I accepted help that I intended to return. He asked from whom. Salman objected on relevance and privacy. The judge sustained. The attorney walked the line beside the voicemail without naming it. He asked if I ever kept something off the books. I said no. He smirked. He asked if I had a thumb drive. I said yes. He asked if it contained confession. I said it contained a file with that name. He asked why I named it that. I said I named nothing. He asked if I watched her open it. I said no. He asked if I know what is inside. I said yes. He asked what it contains. Salman objected, pending authentication. The judge held the question. He pressed the idea that I was vengeful. He tried to paint my visits to the registry as obsession. He tried to frame my notes as a diary of anger, not a record of facts. I did not follow him there. I answered with dates and nouns. The judge thanked me and released me from the stand. Then Salman called the forensic technician who had reviewed the thumb drive I had placed under her laptop stand. The technician wore gloves and spoke in plain steps. Chain of custody. Device hash. File metadata. The folder on the drive contained a single video file. The file had a creation date that predated the dinner by a week. The file had not been edited since. The technician did not play the content. The technician only described the shell. Her attorney objected on intrusion and entrapment. Salman explained the drive was delivered anonymously to her study and later produced under subpoena. The judge allowed limited authentication and reserved content for later in the day. Salman returned to transfers. He brought in a bookkeeper from my child's company who described routine payments, and then the two pairs that did not fit the pattern. The bookkeeper spoke in rows and columns. No heat. The rows and columns aligned with the registry days. The judge marked the correlation as a note, not a finding. Notes still bend the arc of a day. I watched her face as the sequence settled. Her mouth lost its careful ease. She touched a ring and forgot to let it go. She whispered to her attorney, and he gave a half nod that looked like a promise he did not feel. When the examiner repeated the core point, different hands, different loops, different pressure, she shifted her gaze to the gallery, then to the floor, then to me. The look that had once made me feel small now slipped. Confidence cracked in the open, the way a plate cracks when heat meets cold too fast. The judge asked for a recess. The room rose, then loosened into clusters. I stood at the window and watched a pigeon drop from the ledge and catch itself midair. Salman joined me and spoke low. He said the case had crossed a ridge. He said the other side would push harder now, not softer. He said I would need to hold steady for one more turn. When the court reconvened, the judge looked to the counsel tables and asked whether any additional witness would address the sequence rather than the emotion. Salman turned, glanced at me, and then looked past me to the last bench. The bench where my child sat with both hands clasped and eyes on the floor. He rose and spoke a name. My child's name. The clerk called it again for the record. My child stood, slow at first, then straight, and walked down the aisle toward the witness stand. The walk to the stand looked longer than it was. My child kept eyes on the rail, not on me, not on her. The oath sounded like a whisper. The judge asked gentle questions about name, age, relation, employment. The voice that answered belonged to the same person I had raised, and also to a stranger shaped by years I could not hold. The court settled into a listening stillness that made small sounds loud. A pen clicked and then stopped. Someone shifted a shoe against the floor and then froze. Salman began with a page from the timeline. He placed it on the ledge and spoke softly. He asked about a night years ago when a document was signed in a hurry. My child swallowed, glanced at me once, and then looked back at the page. The date sat there like a nail. They described a series of calls that day, messages that started calm and ended sharp. They said there had been talk of a deadline, of a window that would close if a signature did not appear before morning. They said the words used were urgent and simple and just a formality. He asked who attended. My child said 3 people and a 4th on speaker. The names carried no adjectives, just wait. He asked where it happened. They said at home, at the same table where birthdays and small victories had been celebrated. The sentence cut, because rooms hold memory like mirrors hold faces, and reflection does not choose what to show. He asked whether my child had read the document. A long pause came, the kind that stretches until someone breaks. My child said no. The words sounded small and full of years. He asked why. My child said the room had been crowded with pressure. They said one voice called me difficult. They said another voice promised convenience. They said the person on speaker kept repeating that delays cost money and respect. They said that when hesitation showed, the papers were stacked and squared and the pen was slid close. He asked whether consent felt free. My child's mouth shook before the answer formed. They said consent felt like a door that opens to a hallway that narrows until only one step remains. They said they signed because love teaches compliance when conflict is punished. They said they signed because the person they loved said it would keep peace. They said they signed because the oldest fear in a family is losing a place at the table. The judge wrote a note. The gallery stayed silent. Salman moved to the deed. He asked whether my child recognized the version without the clause. They said they had seen that copy after the night in question. He asked if they had been told about the change. They said no. He asked whether they understood the effect of the missing words. They said not then. He asked when they understood. They said when rooms began to close and decisions began to pass them without voice. He placed the small bank statement on the rail. He asked if my child knew the account. Suffix. They said they had never seen that suffix on family paperwork. He asked if anyone explained the transfer the night before the registry print. They said no. He asked if, after learning these pieces, they confronted her. My child lifted eyes to meet his and then lowered them again. They said they tried once and were told that ignorant people should not handle sharp tools. They said they stopped asking. Her attorney rose. He tried to smile. He tried to soften his words, but something rigid sat under the tone. He asked if my child loved their partner. My child said yes. He asked if love can look like pressure when deadlines are real. My child said love should not look like fear. He asked if they had benefited from her planning. My child said comfort can be made from stolen cloth. He asked if I had filled their mind with suspicion. My child said I had filled their childhood with honesty. He asked if my child remembered me ever urging them to take sides. They said I had urged them to sleep when they could not eat and to breathe when they could not speak. He left that line alone. He moved to the winter of the envelope. He asked if my child knew about a loan without paperwork. My chest tightened again. Salman stood and objected for privacy and relevance. The judge looked at both counsel, weighed the slope of the day, and overruled in part. The attorney asked my child if they had ever seen me hide money. My child said no. He asked if they had ever heard me ask someone to keep a favor off the books. My child said no. He asked if they would be shocked to learn that I had accepted secret help. My child said pain does strange things to days, and that they would not judge the past by the comfort of the present. The attorney frowned and folded the question back into his brief like a blade that did not cut. He asked if my child wanted the house. My child said they wanted a home that does not rely on lies. He asked if they blamed her for all wrongs. They said blame is not a plan. He asked if they believed she changed the deed. They said they believed the record. He asked if they wanted to repair the marriage. They looked at the floor and said they wanted sleep without a voice in their ear telling them who to be. He tried a final pivot. He asked if my child had ever raised a hand in anger, ever shouted, ever broken a cup. My child said yes to the shout, no to the hand, yes to the cup that slipped and shattered during a week of constant calls. He asked if guilt could color memory. My child said guilt colors everything and then slowly fades if truth sits in the light. He sat. The room breathed again. Salman returned for 3 questions. He asked if my child had been threatened on the night of the signing. The answer came slow. Not with words, they said, but with removal. He asked removal of what? They said removal of love, removal of access, removal of basic peace. He asked if they signed because they chose or because they feared. They said they feared. The word fell heavy and did not bounce. Silence took the room. It was a full silence, not an empty one. Even the judge let it stand for a long count. My child turned toward me then, and the face I saw was the face of a person who had learned the cost of quiet and had paid it in monthly pieces. Tears came and were brushed away with the back of a hand in a gesture as familiar to me as their first steps. I felt the arm rest under my palm and realized I had been holding it like a life rope. She stood, unbidden, and the judge held up a hand to stop her. She sat again, jaw tight, eyes burning with a mix of fury and appeal. She looked at my child with a softness she had used to win arguments, a softness that once worked like a key. It did not work now. My child looked down and pressed lips together. Salman asked the judge to mark the testimony that consent had been compelled by fear of removal. The judge did. Her attorney requested a recess to consult. Denied. The judge asked whether any further evidence went to sequence rather than feeling. Salman said yes and introduced one last photo from the registry, cropped to show the bandage on the clerk's finger and the ledger overlapping the guide card by exactly 2 millimeters, a known quirk from that year's counter layout. It tied the old deed to the day before the first suspicious print. It closed the loop. The judge leaned back, steepled fingers, and looked at each table in turn, then looked at my child for a long moment, as if measuring the span between innocence and survival. The voice that followed carried no warmth and no contempt. It carried weight. The court will not rush, the judge said. Verification reports will be reviewed with care. Written submissions on the question of coercion will be accepted by noon tomorrow. The verdict is postponed until morning. Counsel will instruct all parties to avoid contact that could influence testimony. The court expects silence outside this room. We adjourn. The gavel did not fall hard, but it sounded through my bones. Benches scraped. People stood. The room returned to the chatter of fabric and footsteps, and yet no one spoke to us. Salman gathered files with the motions of a person who trusts routine when storms rise. Her attorney whispered to her, and she shook her head once, then twice, a denial or a refusal, I could not tell. My child stepped down and did not look at either table. They walked toward me with the slow certainty of someone who has run out of ways to pretend. We stood close but did not touch. Words would have broken the fragile balance we had just found. Outside, the sky had gone the color of paper soaked and left to dry. Salman said he would work through the night. Her attorney surely would too. The judge had given us one evening where outcome could not be guessed, and sleep would be an act of faith neither side could perform. We left the building without fanfare. On the steps, my child reached for my hand, then pulled back, then reached again. This time I held on. We walked to the car like people who understand that truth is heavy and still worth the lifting. In the mirror, I saw her standing under the stone arch, phone in hand, face set in a plan I could not read. My pulse counted beats that did not calm. At home, the house did not feel like shelter. I placed the folder on the table and turned off every light except one. Pages waited. Sleep did not come. Somewhere across town, she lay awake under a different lamp, her mind racing in lines that cut, not in circles that soothe. The city moved. The night stretched. The verdict sat in the dark between us like a sealed envelope both sides could feel, but not open. Morning came with a sky the color of old steel. I reached the courthouse early and sat outside the courtroom door with my folder closed. Salman arrived with 2 thin binders and a face that gave nothing away. He asked how I slept. I said I watched the ceiling and counted breaths that did not help. He nodded once and checked the time. People began to gather in quiet clusters. I saw her at the end of the corridor, suit pressed, hair set, the kind of polish that used to make rooms soften. It did not soften me now. We took our places. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered with the same careful pace as always, eyes steady, voice even. The clerk handed up the reports first. The handwriting examiner's findings sat on top, then the chain of custody notes for the notebooks, the photographs, the tape lifts, the fingerprints, the email headers, the bank statements. The judge read in silence long enough for the air to thin. The voice that followed did not rise. It moved like a straight line. The court found that signatures on the later deed pages were not made by the same hand that signed the original. The loop on the S, the pen pressure, the entry and exit points, the hesitation marks, the ridge pattern left by a thumb at the margin, each element aligned with imitation, not habit. The missing clause had not been lost by a machine. It had been removed by design. The logbooks showed no lawful ticket authorizing any alteration. The photographs from years ago fixed the baseline. The later copies broke from it. The finding on coercion arrived next. The testimony of my child described consent obtained through fear of removal. Not threats of pain, but threats of isolation, loss of access, and erosion of peace. The court recognized that fear is force. The transfers surrounding key dates, though modest, formed a pattern that moved with the registry timeline. The court would not name motive. The court would name sequence. The judge's tone did not change when the order came. The deed with the intact clause was restored to effect. Any later filings that relied on the altered version were void. Control returned to the structure that existed before the night of the hurried signing. Occupancy rights revived. Subdivision controls revived. All attempts to skirt consent through paperwork that pretended to be routine were stripped away. The court froze any further movement until filings were corrected in the registry under supervision. The judge paused, then addressed my child. The court thanked them for truth that cost more than most testimonies. The judge addressed me next. The court noted that patience can keep harm from turning into chaos. The judge addressed her last. The court spoke of responsibility borne by those who manage systems that families cannot see. The words were dry. The meaning was not. Her attorney stood to ask for a stay. Denied. He asked for limited time to lodge an appeal. Allowed in standard form, without disturbing restoration. He tried 2 more doors and found them closed. He sat. She did not. She remained standing as if posture could still set tempo. Her hands trembled once, then locked at the wrists. Salman leaned toward me and whispered that we had reached the ridge and crossed it. I kept my eyes on the bench. The judge signed. The clerk read the order aloud. Each sentence landed like a nail tapped true. I felt no rush of triumph. I felt a weight lift that I had carried so long I had forgotten its shape. We rose. The benches creaked. People began to talk again. Thin voices stretched over nerves that had been held too tight. I turned to leave and saw my child at the aisle. Their face was pale and wet and open. We did not embrace in the room. We did not add drama to a day that already held too much. We walked together toward the door. She intercepted us near the threshold. The elegance she wore like armor cracked in front of everyone. Rage pushed through the seams. Her mouth shook. Her eyes were bright in a way that looked like light on glass before it shatters. She called me calculated. She called me cold. She called me an architect of humiliation. She said I had turned paper into knives. She said I had ruined a marriage. She said I had poisoned her name. She said I had trained my child to betray. The words came fast, not like hers usually do, but like water breaking through a wall. No one answered. The bailiff stepped closer. Salman kept his hands at his sides. My child took a half step behind me and then back to my shoulder. She leaned in until her breath touched my cheek and her perfume smelled like a mask melting. She said something low that only I could hear. She said revenge never ends. She said even if courts close doors, real battles move to other rooms. She said stories spread. She said some secrets stay useful even when truth wins on paper. She said she would make sure I lived with whispers that follow me into markets and weddings and graves. She spoke with the certainty of someone who has always counted on fear to finish what law cannot. I did not move. For years, I had imagined this exact moment, and the mind loves to add grand gestures to imagined scenes. In real life, there was only my breath, steady now, and the knowledge that noise cannot reach a person who refuses to carry it. We left the doorway and stepped into the corridor. The light seemed too bright after the room. Reporters waited at the end of the hall with microphones and wide eyes. Salman lifted a hand and said there would be no comment beyond the order that was now public. Her attorney tried to shape a line for the cameras. He spoke about respect for process. He spoke about future filings. He did not speak about the loop on the S. Outside, the steps held clusters of people who acted as if they had not been staring into the same story minutes ago. My child and I reached the bottom and paused. The city moved around us. Buses, vendors, pigeons. I felt ground under my shoes. Not a courtroom floor, not a registry tile, just ground. I let myself stand on it. She followed with two of her relatives at her shoulder. The relatives tried to gather her, tried to place a buffer of smiles and statements between her and the air. She brushed them aside and came close again, not for the cameras this time, but for the old habit of winning battles at close range. Her voice dropped to a whisper that shook with fury. Revenge never ends, she said. It follows. It grows in new soil. It finds your quiet and breaks it when you think you have peace. I turned and looked at her, not with anger, not with pity, but with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm when the roofs still drip and the birds return anyway. I spoke once, calm and plain. It does, when one side stops hating. She blinked, and for a breath the rage lost its script. She stepped back. The relatives stepped in. Cameras swung toward us, and then away. Salman touched my elbow and suggested we go. We walked to the car through voices that could not find another scene to feed on. Behind us, her attorney spoke into microphones with the careful tone of a person who wants time to mend a story. Time does not mend what truth has set right. Time only teaches people how to stand next to it. At home, I placed the order on the table and read it again, not for victory, but for clarity. Restoration is not a parade. It is a key that fits the right door after months of trying others. I opened windows. Air moved through rooms that had held the smell of waiting. My child went to the back step and sat in the sun. We did not talk about what comes next. Some days do not ask for plans. Some days ask for breath. Before evening, I called the old clerk to thank him. He said only that ledgers like honest endings. I made tea, poured 2 cups, set one at the empty chair where my late spouse would have sat. I did not speak aloud. I did not ask the house to remember. Houses already remember. My phone vibrated once on the table. A single message from an unknown number lit the screen with a short sentence about appeals and storms and the futility of peace. I turned the phone face down and let it buzz itself back into silence. Outside, a neighbor laughed at something I could not hear. A child ran past the gate. A kite pulled against a string and found its height. I folded the order and placed it in a plain envelope. Not a trophy, a boundary. I set the envelope in the drawer where keys live, where everyday things carry use, not drama. The house felt lighter. The night came softer. Sleep did not rush in, but it did not run away either. I lay down with the window slightly open and the city alive beyond it. The truth was not a weapon in my hand anymore. It was a wall that would stand without me guarding it every hour. I closed my eyes and let the wall hold. I began to live quietly. The noise that had filled every hour for years had nowhere left to stand. The order was final, the paperwork complete. The house remained mine, yet it no longer felt like a battlefield. I repaired what needed fixing, the cracked window frame, the loose tiles, the small leaks the rain had whispered through. I grew used to the sound of my own footsteps without tension behind them. I did not celebrate. There was no victory in it. I made tea, folded laundry, kept the books in order, and paid bills on time. The world had not turned golden. It had simply stopped bleeding. My child came often, but never stayed long. They were rebuilding their own kind of peace, one that did not depend on either of us pretending forgiveness is quick. We spoke of weather, of recipes, of daily things that do not wound. That was enough. Some neighbors stopped by with cautious kindness. Their words circled around the topic, but never landed on it. People respect silence when it hides something heavier than gossip. I thanked them, smiled when it was easy, and closed the gate when it was not. Life turned smaller in the best way. One room lit, one meal cooked, one night's sleep earned. I found my spouse's handwriting again one morning in the back of a book. A short note, half grocery list, half reminder. It said, "Peace is not the reward for winning. It is the choice that ends the game." I read it twice, then placed it inside my notebook next to the line I had written months before. Lies carry weight, but so does silence kept for the wrong reason. Together they made sense. Justice had come through the court, but dignity had returned long before. Some days, I walked to the registry just to see the clerk's new trainees at work. They treated the ledgers with care, the same way one holds fragile glass. When they saw me, they nodded. I never mentioned the case. I no longer needed proof. Proof had done its work. Now it belonged to paper and archives. She appealed, of course. It was her habit to fight the air when the ground no longer moved. The higher court dismissed it quietly. No drama this time, no witnesses. Only a short order that arrived in the mail, folded once. I read it, placed it in the file, and felt nothing but stillness. That was the sign I had been waiting for, the absence of reaction, the return of ordinary calm. Once, I saw her outside a cafe, surrounded by people I did not know. She looked smaller, not in body but in presence. Her laughter was thin, her eyes restless. She saw me and froze for half a second, then turned away as if the past had teeth. I did not feel hate. I felt distance, the kind that protects rather than punishes. At night, I sometimes sat on the porch with tea and thought about all the years spent planning, waiting, building careful traps made of truth. Revenge had disguised itself as justice at first, but underneath it, I had only wanted acknowledgement. I wanted someone to say, "You were wronged." The court had said it on paper, but the real acknowledgement had to come from within. The longer I stared at the stars, the more I realized that revenge had never been about punishment. It had been about reclaiming dignity from the hands that twisted it. I stopped checking the news. I stopped keeping copies of everything. I let files gather dust. The fight had taken enough of my life. The rest would belong to quiet mornings and clean conscience. My child found laughter again, softer now, but honest. When they smiled, I saw something like sunlight breaking through old clouds. I learned to accept that peace does not erase scars. It just lets them fade without needing to explain. Some nights, the dream returns, the courtroom, the voice, the papers. But even in dreams, I no longer defend myself. I simply listen, knowing the record speaks in my place. That is the gift truth gives when you have finally paid its cost. I planted a small garden in the backyard. Nothing extravagant. Just mint, basil, a few marigolds. Growth that asks for water, not applause. The air smells cleaner now. Time moves slower. Silence has weight again, but not the heavy kind. It feels earned. When I think of her words, revenge never ends. I understand the trap she built for herself. Revenge feeds on hate, and hate feeds on fear. Once you stop feeding either, they starve. My revenge did not end with the verdict or the property or the applause of a room that had already forgotten. It ended when I stopped caring whether she ever said sorry. The one thing the daughter-in-law never knew, my revenge ended long before the verdict. It ended the day I stopped waiting for an apology.